Good morning, everyone. I'd like to just first say thank you so much to Dominique and to the Ukrainian Studies program and everyone that made this possible. I'm very excited to be here and be part of all of these conversations. So what I'm going to be speaking about is a very small part of what happened at Maidan. There are so many things, and I have to credit my colleague Emily Chanel for pointing out perhaps more vehemently than anyone else, at least in my sphere of academia, that there were so many things that happened and there were multiple Maidans. And this is just one bit that stood out to me in my capacity as someone who self-identifies as a drug use ethnographer in Ukraine. So on December 12th, 2013, Liza Shaposhnik, a volunteer at Kyiv's EuroMaidan protests, was interviewed by Radio Svoboda. "I came to Maidan to stand up for my rights," she said. "The European Union is for us a chance to live well and to have a normal life," or жить нормально, is what she said. This phrase, to have a normal life or live a normal life, was often invoked by activists as they elaborated the broad goals that they held for themselves and their country. It was frequently mentioned, as protesters explained to me, the declaration of dignity that the Euromaidan protests embodied. This paper explores this discursive enactment of dignity, both within and outside of the Maidan movement. Specifically, it considers how and why some Ukrainians became integrated into the movement and afforded meaningful personhood on the Maidan, while others were stripped of subjectivity or dehumanized, excluded from the new society that Euromaidan claimed to represent. Primarily, I argue that the praxis of dignity in a post-Maidan Ukraine is not only a rejection of state corruption and violence, but also a form of biopower, or a social reckoning and policing of individuals' inner psychological states. Mikhailo Vinitsky reflected on the claim that Maidan was a revolution of dignity with the following words: "The concept of dignity as expressed on Maidan is distinctly different from Anglo-American individualism. Dignity is a concept that can only be actualized in a relational sense. In order to have dignity, an individual must be recognized as having it by another. Thus, dignity requires more than individualistic conceptions of the subject. Dignity is only possible within a collectivity of persons." With this definition in mind, it should come as no surprise that the most potent icons of dignity to emerge from the Euromaidan movement were individuals who were both successful within and made intelligible by the collective labor force that maintained the revolution. A prime example is activist Liza Shaposhnik, who worked in the kitchens. Liza's work and activism were widely celebrated, and the media paid a great deal of attention to her. Scraps of things that she said and various details about her life were used to weave a meaningful and popular narrative that cast her as an independent, hardworking, and above all, deserving human being. This popularly told narrative of Liza Shaposhnik goes something like this. She was born with cerebral palsy, the daughter of a Russian mother and a Ukrainian father. She was born in Siberia, but then grew up in Odessa. As a young adult, she moved to the Donetsk region, where she was able to rent a room in a hostel and support herself independently as a fruit vendor. Finally, in September of 2013, Liza moved to Kyiv in the hopes of improving her situation. She rented her own apartment and again began working as a vendor. 2 months after she arrived, the Euromaidan movement began to take shape. Liza immediately decided to join the efforts, and upon learning that volunteers were being recruited to assist, reported to the kitchens to see if there was anything she could do. Limited mobility in her hands prevented her from taking on the vast majority of jobs available, such as slicing produce and carrying food trays. But she persisted and soon settled into a semi-permanent job, tearing the tags off of the strings of tea bags, allegedly to keep them from tangling and individual cups from spilling as they were distributed from a tray. Despite the arguably modest value of her work product, her role as a teabag organizer seems to have been highly satisfactory to the other volunteers, who saw as much, if not more, value in Liza having a job to do than in the work product her job produced. In other words, Liza was valued not simply for her work, but for the fact that she wanted to work, for the fact that she did work. Liza's tireless efforts inspired such affection and respect from her coworkers that they named the kitchens in Maidan in her honor. The media also took pains to present this story within the larger political frame of the revolution, repeatedly quoting Liza's statements on the alleged superiority of European values over the status quo under Yanukovych. In Europe, she was quoted saying, "People with disabilities are a part of society, and here I can't even receive the benefits afforded to me by law." Liza's story has been crafted as a microcosm of the entire movement. It is above all a story of redemption. She is described by the public and journalists as deserving, humble, the most important drop of water in the ocean, as one of her Facebook fan pages calls her, Liza became a local hero because she overcame powerful obstacles to achieve social acceptance and integration, that fantasy-like normal life that was positioned at the center of EuroMaidan's collective imagination. This fantastic normality, so beautifully encapsulated in Liza's story, stood out to me because it was a narrative that I had been already hearing for over a year, long before the revolution began. That winter, I was already in Kyiv conducting research on methadone maintenance therapy for chronic opiate users. In interviews with many methadone patients, they portrayed their motivations for starting treatment in identical terms. They wanted to live like normal people. Жить как нормальные люди. Addicts' personal narratives were strikingly similar to Liza's in other ways as well. Addicts, too, suffer intense social marginalization. A powerful stigma surrounds drug abuse, and many poorer addicts who lack the financial prowess to conceal their behaviors find themselves rejected by employers, by neighbors, even by family. Like Liza, they see their situation as cruel, as difficult, as unfair, and they resolve to take deliberate steps towards improving and achieving normality in their lives. In yet another parallel, addicts also define the normality that they seek as the fulfillment of social roles and social obligations that once defined them. One woman at a Kyiv clinic described her situation this way: I would like to have a husband. I want to prepare my daughter to take care of herself. That's the most important thing, getting your kids up on their own 2 feet. Obviously, I want to find a job. Eventually, I'll have a job. With this program, you can find a job because you just come in the morning, you take your pills, and then for the rest of the day, you're free. You feel fine, just like a normal person. This woman's words show that she's motivated, has goals, sees a clear treatment trajectory for herself through this program, but she frames that normality of her life in terms of her gendered domestic roles and uses the fulfillment of those roles as a yardstick against which to measure her process. So as Vinitsky has already observed, the mode of social integration that's being sought, both in the case of substitution therapy patients and in the case of that idealized revolutionary narrative of Liza's, it's intimately linked with a particular form of collective personhood. It's a subjectivity that anthropologist Elizabeth Dunn has called a dividual person as opposed to an individual person, someone who acts on the world by acting on others. Such relationships, being caught up in webs of exchange and mutual dependencies, have entered into popular vernacular through concepts like blat and krugovaya poruka, forms of solidarity in which a person is part of a bigger social unit, tied up by joint responsibility and mutual obligations. This state of being tied up in normative social obligations is precisely the mode of collective dignity that Liza achieved in that popular narrative told about her, and it is the goal towards which so many substitution therapy patients strive. The great irony, however, is that methadone patients who seek the same goals for themselves that Liza was celebrated for achieving were not celebrated and continue to not be celebrated. They were not welcome inside the barricades at all. This was an overt and well-known rule on the Maidan. From the earliest days of protests, signs were hung at the gates of the barricades indicating that neither alcoholics, nor drug users, nor the substances they used were to enter into the area under any circumstances. So for people who are living with addiction, who are treating addiction with methadone, this meant permanent exclusion from the physical territory of the revolution. To avoid taking the social stigma of drug use on the Maidan and elsewhere in Ukraine for granted, I'd like to look at this exclusionary rule in the context of other social groups that were seen as enemies or others on the Maidan. For example, anti-Maidan activists. According to protesters with whom I spoke, they were weak in conscience, weak in spirit, and willing to turn over their goals and ideals for just a matter of hryvnia. People called them cattle. People called them slaves. People called them prostitutes. I even heard the portmanteau prostitushki used disparagingly against them. Similar epithets were launched against Berkut officers. These people were brainwashed, they were zombies, they were animals, not even human. And quickly we see that these opponents of Maidan were characterized in similar ways, as weak in their moral constitution, surrendering human values for meager incentives, brainwashed, brain damaged, incapable of acting like humans, or worst of all, not human to begin with. Addicts are likewise perceived in popular culture and clinic culture as zombie-like individuals, hopelessly lost to their wanton impulses. They are depicted as truly Pavlovian creatures, having little to no control over themselves, little to no control over their behaviors. They cannot contribute to the collective because, like Berkut and anti-Maidan protesters, they are imagined to be spiritually empty vessels. Given all this, I suggest that the discourse of dignity that appeared on the Maidan was not only an expression of social collectivity. It was also a unique mechanism of social exclusion that policed the boundary of that collective. By making claims about the liberty with which people are able to use their own minds or think freely, a clear determination has been made as to whether such individuals can be integrated into the collective and can be situated within dignity in a relational sense, within the collectivity of persons. So in sum, through the gorgeous popular narrative of Lisa Shaposhnik's social redemption, one I might mention that she probably had no control over, we can see quite clearly that the social value of a normal life, or the adoption of a socially intelligible, individual subjectivity enacted through the fulfillment of social obligations. Through the exclusionary practices on Maidan, we also see that in order to achieve that normal life, one must volley, with a system of social distinction that equates preferred forms of sobriety and self-sacrifice with spiritual cleanliness, with deservedness, that renders those with socially unacceptable, problematic, or incomprehensible behaviors undeserving and even inhuman. This phenomenon is not unique to EuroMaidan. The revolution has allowed me to witness it and articulate it in new terms, but I've seen this very mechanism at work in my own research among Ukraine's drug-using and HIV-positive population for many years. This is also not necessarily meant as a criticism of any of the discourses that came out of Maidan. A careful and deliberate consideration of all of those things requires much, much more time and detail than I have available to me at the current moment. But it bears mentioning that this pattern is likely at work in many more social, professional, and political spheres as well. As Ukraine is in the painful throes of reestablishing or establishing national identity, coping with militant forces within its borders, and attempting to shift the practices of the powerful away from corruption and towards accountability and transparency, I believe it will be necessary to keep this particular pattern of social distinction in the front of our minds, to recognize exclusionary efforts, examine them, and understand their full social and moral consequences, for they surely have a role to play in Ukraine's future. Thank you.